Hey everybody, this is Angelo Villagomez with the Center for American Progress, here today with our fourth episode of Under the Pala Pala. Today our topic is recruiting and retaining Native talent at NGOs, and I've got two of my good friends here with me. My first guest was actually born on the same island as me. My friend Javen is from the island of Guam, and he works here in Washington, D.C. Hey Javen, can you just go ahead and tell everybody who you are?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Javen Santos. I am born and raised in the island of Guam, and I moved out to Washington, D.C. about a year ago to work for the Climate Initiative. It's an environmental organization that seeks to empower youth voices through climate action.
I also want to introduce you to my friend Michaela, who also lives in Washington, D.C. Michaela, can you tell me about who you are?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name is Michaela Pavlot. I am Ojibwe or Anishinaabe from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. So I'm originally from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I moved down to DC about 5 years ago. I work for the National Parks Conservation Association. I am the Senior Coordinator of Outreach and Engagement in the Mid-Atlantic region.
So Javen, we're both from Guam. Can you tell me a little bit about how you ended up traveling from Guam to Washington, D.C. to work for an NGO?
When I was in college, I interned for an organization called the Conference of Asian Pacific American Leadership. Through those networks, I was able to find the job that I'm working at today with the Climate Initiative. And that opportunity to work in the intersections of youth and climate issues is what brought me to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, my journey is very similar. DC is such a hub for policy and for, I mean, federal nation-to-nation relationships with tribes. Tribe leaders are always here. And I came down originally to be an educator at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I learned so much there, and I was ready to kind of expand and take advocacy elsewhere. But I was really drawn into NGOs and other places where people want to work with tribes. People want to engage in Indigenous conservation, especially with, Deb Haaland up in the Department of the Interior. We have amazing leadership in the DOI. I felt like, yeah, that was possible. As a Native woman, I could also do something similar. Through NPCA, I've learned quite a bit about the interesting relationships between parks, and Indigenous people coming into that space. It kind of feels like, it definitely is Native land. So it is up to Native people to also manage that.
So Michaela, you've been in town for about a year now. How many other Native staff have you come across working at other NGOs?
At NPCA in the office, there are very few Native staff in DC. And I've haven't met very many. I mean, Angela, I met you at a Native conference. I see other Native people that work, but they also usually work for their tribes and they're doing two other jobs.
I'm a little bit older than you guys, and I was several years into my career before I looked around and realized I was like the only Pacific Islander working in Washington, D.C. And it's because, I was doing tons of work in the Pacific and I was doing tons of work in the Caribbean. And every time I would fly to these islands, I was working with Indigenous folks and local communities. But for some reason, it didn't dawn on me for like years that I was the only Pacific Islander working for the NGOs in Washington, D.C. So, Javen, we were talking the other day. I'm pretty sure we're the only two Pacific Islander men who work for national NGOs in Washington, D.C. And I just, do you come across a lot of other Native staff, either with your NGO or other NGOs here in D.C.?
My NGO is pretty small and it's a lot of remote staff. We're all across the country, but I am the only Pacific Islander in a predominantly white organization. I've been in several of these national spaces where I'm the only Pacific Islander in a climate space when there is a large amount of Pacific Islanders here in the US, and Pacific Islanders are on the forefront of climate issues. So I think that that's something that I hope to see grow and have more Pacific Islanders enter these spaces in the years to come.
So, Michaela and Javen, the reason I wanted to talk to the two of you is because I met, Javen, I met you at a book signing. And Michaela, I met you at a Native conference. Um, but we are like we're like endangered species here in Washington D.C. We talked about there are Native staff who work back at home. Sometimes they call it out in the field. So like back on Guam or back on in Hawaii, or there may be Native staff working for the tribe. But here in Washington D.C., working for the NGOs, particularly like the big NGOs, there's hardly any Native staff. And so, I want to ask the two of you, like, why do you think it's important for NGOs to have Native staff? And Michaela, why don't you go first?
We have this Native leadership right now, and we also have, an administration that is pushing for Indigenous led conservation or traditional ecological knowledge to be a part of how we tackle climate and how we start to even address conservation. And then there's people that, that have worked in the field as predominantly white, and you have to say oftentimes a fraught relationship between tribes and conservationists. And conservation organizations are stepping up, and they of course need Native people. They need that knowledge directly from the source. So now is the time to hire these people.
And Javon, what do you think? Why do you think it's important for NGOs to have Native staff on the team here in Washington, D.C.?
A lot of these larger environmental orgs still don't have the representation from Native and Indigenous Pacific Islander communities. And it's really unfortunate, because if we're going to be making policy decisions, or if we're going to be doing advocacy that's equitable, it needs to include all different voices. But at the same time, I think that a lot of these larger environmental organizations tend to be very extractive in terms of like our Indigenous knowledge and our resources, and tend to perpetuate a lot of problematic complexes. But if these orgs have Native staff that can bring the perspectives of the communities, then they can be a part of preventing those systems from being perpetuated by being a part of the decision making that's needed in these organizations.
Michaela, do you have any ideas on what NGOs can do to attract more Native staff?
For NGOs, I think they can even have specific positions for Indigenous people. You also need to create that organizational understanding and allyship to have not even just like a base knowledge, but that they're there to support and understand this work. So we need to be taking a look at the experts in the field and what they've been doing, what communities have been doing for thousands of years, to really change the way that we're thinking and operating. Of course, it matches that, but you need to take it even a step further to have it all the way from the top, and to have like an open and welcoming space, so Indigenous people feel like they can be themselves, can be open to share their knowledge.
Yeah, I appreciated what you said, Michaela, about bringing it all the way to the top, because if a board has Indigenous or Pacific Islander staff, that is or board members, that is very welcoming to me. But I think that NGOs need to be intentional with outreach. And I know that organizations have the resources to be more intentional with the outreach. It's just about prioritizing that. And I think back home, there needs to be something facilitated for Indigenous youth, Indigenous people who are looking to get into these, or Indigenous people who are just trying to survive, to realize that entering these spaces is important and can be a part of survival.
Hiring is really just like the beginning. We also have to retain Indigenous staff. What would you recommend to NGOs for actually then retaining Native staff for the long term, so that they can see themselves growing in their career and staying in this field and staying with these organizations?
Yeah, when Michaela mentioned a welcoming environment, I think that is really important to facilitate. I can talk to my experience of like some of the experiences that I've had from like miscommunications or like things that have been said that were might have been well intended, but can come across as offensive to Pacific Islander or to Indigenous communities. I think that DC is well known for using young professionals until for a couple years until they're burnt out, and then they uh, either have a quarter life crisis or find something else. And I think that Indigenous and Pacific Islander people are no exception to that. So I think facilitating better working conditions, quality of life for Indigenous people, and cultural understanding are some of the things that I think would be a great start to retaining staff.
We've talked a lot about coming directly from our communities and then getting thrown into Washington, D.C. Workforce. It is a culture shock. If you don't really have a space to support Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, and the understanding and maybe the difference of operations, you definitely lose people. So I think creating a space to be open, but also to share your knowledge and feel that people are listening to you is huge. And not just your colleagues, but your supervisors, that you feel like as an Indigenous person, you feel heard, and people are creating a space to be open to share those ideas, and not just within, the Jedi teams or the equity teams, or it's not just like a one-time training. It's a continuous conversation.
I appreciated what you mentioned about, like culture shock and how hard that is. And, we're talking about like making it easier for Indigenous people Native people to get access to these jobs and these opportunities. But sometimes it's a lot to ask of a Native person to leave their community to come out here. It's important for us to do so, but it can be a huge challenge. Even for me, I've lived out here a year and I'm already thinking like, I miss my community so much. So, when we talk about like building a healthy culture, I think about like having opportunities for community building within the NGO space, but also just like on a personal level, I think is really important for retaining Native people in DC in these policy spaces in general.